Number 10, the 1965 Chevrolet Corvair. Well, you have to start somewhere, and in my quest to create a well-rounded list of vehicle types, I'll start with General Motors' first ever economy car, their infamous, unsafe at any speed Chevrolet Corvair. But not any Corvair. They're updated for 1965 models, and in particular, the two-door hardtops. Chevrolet substantially updated their rear-engine Corvair for 1965 with a new body so gorgeous that car and drivers haughty David E. Davis cited it as being the most beautiful car to go on sale in this country since before World War II. Along with the new body came a slew of mechanical upgrades that mitigated many of the problems the 1960 to 1964 cars had. Car and Driver magazine claimed it was the best handling car made in America at the time by a mile. That really wasn't saying much, but it was worth noting. Their engines were still air-cooled six-cylinder boxer-type engines plopped out back, but they never were drag-strip cars, even in turbocharged guys. But if buyers wanted a sporty-looking economy car that could actually handle and was drop-dead gorgeous, they'd be hard-pressed to do much better than a 1965 to 1969 Chevrolet Corvair. I'm partial to these hardtop coupes, but these were also available as convertibles, or what were known as spiders, and four-door hardtops. Number 9, the 1970 Chevrolet Camaro. Now, you would think a car guy compiling a list of their favorite GM cars from his favorite period in GM's history would rank this car higher than 9th, but given what's also on this list, and just being on this list is high praise, it's understandable where I've placed this lovely ground-pounding heartstopper. 1970 brought about the second-generation Chevrolet Camaro that had an all-new body but rode on a somewhat updated chassis the 1967 through 1969 Camaros did. The cars share the same 108-inch long wheelbase. In my opinion, it seemed General Motors rushed the first-generation Camaro to market in 1967 to compete with the Ford Mustang, and its styling always appeared half-baked or incomplete to me. The 1969 version was without question the best of the first 3 years of the Camaro, but the 1970 Camaro, with its Ferrari-inspired styling, pulled all the loose ends together of the first-generation Camaro to become everything and anything Camaro, which is a made-up word, incidentally, would become over the next 50-plus years. Number 8, the 1963 Buick Riviera. 1963 to 1965, Buick Rivieras might as well be Batman to me. I know they existed, but I don't think I've ever seen one in the wilds except maybe at car shows, and seeing an antique car at a car show doesn't count as actually seeing one. Much like touching down in an airport in a city you've never been to doesn't count as you ever actually having been there. Some say GM fired back at Ford and their 1958 four-passenger Thunderbird in 1961 with their Oldsmobile Starfire, and in 1962 with their Pontiac Grand Prix, but let's be real. GM's real salvo at Ford was with their 1963 Buick Riviera. Legend has it these cars, which were a corporate design and not a Buick per se, were offered to all GM divisions, including Cadillac, but they all passed on it. Ah, the days of GM divisional autonomy. Can you imagine? Buick jumped on this and a legend was born. Number 7, 1957 Chevrolet Nomad. Number 7 is actually a 2-in-1. Again, I want this to be a well-rounded list of different vehicle types, and vehicle types spread broadly across the 26 model years between 1948 and 1972. So the 1957 Chevrolet Nomad being on this list takes out 2 birds with 1 stone, which is a horrible saying, by the way. But it not only pays homage to the legendary Tri-5 Chevrolets, but also 2 station wagons. The notion of a station wagon or depot hack was still in its relative infancy in the mid to late 50s. Think of them as the internet in 1995 or so. A great idea, but they weren't quite sure overall what to do with them or where they would go eventually. 2-door station wagons, of whose proportions and design balance I find oddly beguiling, are referred to by some as shooting brakes, the term stemming from hunting parties in the 1890s who used open horse-drawn wagons to carry themselves, their guns, and, whatever they shot. A brake is a wagon used to, quote, break horses. How the 2 terms came together to denote 2-door station wagons is anyone's guess. Chevrolets were all new for 1955, and the 57s, with their somewhat subdued, while simultaneously sky-high tail fins, the penultimate of the breed that I've grown quite fond of over the years. Can you have your cake and eat it too? With the 1957 Chevrolet Nomad, you most certainly can. Number 6, 1956 Chevrolet Corvette. Cliched as it may be, a car guy can't have a top 10 list of his favorite cars without a Corvette being on it. And from the 1948 to 1972 golden era of General Motors, which only encompassed the first 3 generations of America's sports car, which, if you're not aware, is currently on its 8th iteration. As much of a fan of the 3rd generation Corvette as I am, I have a 1977 myself. Through my scratched-up racing goggles, the 1956 Corvette is the best-looking Corvette of all time. The first substantial update of the Corvette's fiberglass or plastic body that debuted in 1953, there's a hardcore sports car seriousness to the 56s that the 53 to 55 models don't have. They're great-looking cars, but I like the 1956 and subsequently through 1962 models better. They had V8s, went as fast as they looked, and have that air of mystery, a James Dean cool, swagger, or danger about them, if you will, that I think a sports car, particularly one from the 1950s, needs to have to stand the test of time and grow old gracefully. I think the design timeless. Number 5, 1967 Cadillac El Dorado. Keeping this list as well-rounded as possible, no car on this list, nor any post-war car by any manufacturer in my opinion, combines rat-pack cool and, at the time, cutting-edge engineering like the 1967 Cadillac El Dorado. Front-wheel drive automobiles weren't even a novelty in the 1960s. They were all but unknown in this country. The 1929 Cord L29 featured front-wheel drive, but the cars were expensive, sold poorly, and didn't survive the Great Depression. With its packaging efficiency, front-wheel drive works best on smaller vehicles. General Motors had planned to use it on an intermediate-sized vehicle at first, but with its complexity and cost to manufacture, General Motors decided it best to be featured on their full-sized luxury coupes. The 1967 Cadillac El Dorado shares much of its running gear with the Oldsmobile Toronado, which was introduced in 1966. In the days of divisional autonomy, Buick rejected front-wheel drive in favor of conventional rear-wheel drive on their version of the Toronado and El Dorado. Think of the 1966 Buick Riviera as a rear-wheel drive Toronado, El Dorado. I find these cars so handsome that their styling all but overshadows what's under its sheet metal. This is GM styling honcho Bill Mitchell and his team at their absolute finest, and it shows in every freshly pressed, sharply creased line. Cadillac built these through 1970 and then turned them into an all but comical parade float from 1971 through 1978, before it got sucked into the great downsizing vortex in 1979. Number 4, 1970 Buick Electra 225. The old deuce and a quarter. We're getting personal here, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that too. Perhaps 1970 Buick Electras are a tad high on my list, but when I think about what makes it here or not, my gotta-have-it meter, the most important criteria, tells me that perhaps these cars should be even higher on this list, but I think it well placed here at 4th. In the summer of 1977, much to my delight, if not cajoling, my father bought a triple brown 4-door 1970 Electra 225 Custom, and it left an indelible impression on me for a number of reasons, most of which I won't bore you with now. The lines of these cars I find exquisite, especially these coupes. They are also available as a convertible. Their quiet, confident stature equally charismatic and comforting. They ooze class from every venti port. That big old Buick made me feel as though I was a rich kid muckety-muck. It made me believe that my family and I were more than we actually were. You can't ask for more than that from something that, at the end of the day, is little more than a conveyance to get you from point A to B. If you're curious, the 225 and Electra 225 refers to the first Electras going back to 1959 being 225 inches long. Number 3, 1957 Cadillac El Dorado Bro. Now, although the Buick Riviera and Chevrolet Corvair were available as 4-doors, again in the interest of a well-rounded list, the only car available exclusively as a 4-door on my list is the 1957 Cadillac El Dorado Bro. Cadillac also built these for model year 1958. It's fairly obvious these cars are Cadillac's response to the Ford Motor Company's Continental Mark II. Yes, a Ford that I actually like. Whereas the Continental Mark II was a coupe only, the El Dorado Brougham looked like a coupe, but it was actually a 4-door hardtop. To keep the handsome coupe dimensions and profile, if not appearance, of the 2-door El Dorado, Cadillac hinged the rear doors on these cars to the seat pillar so they could open out, enabling rear passengers to enter and exit the cars more easily. They're also referred to as suicide doors, given that if, in theory, they're open when the car is moving, rear passengers could easily jump out. The 1957 El Dorado Bro featured a number of industry firsts that don't seem like such a big deal today, but during the second Eisenhower administration, they most certainly were. Quad headlights, automatic headlight dimming, and the first air suspension system on an automobile that leveled itself. All that at the time, technical wizardry enveloped in a unique, handsome, and very expensive package. Cadillac sold just 704 Cadillac El Dorado Bros in 1957 and 1958 combined. Number 2. 1971 Pontiac Grand Prix. Technically, the one that started the personal luxury car craze of the 1970s. Ford may have kicked off the craze with their 1958 Thunderbird. Some say the segment had already been christened by Cadillac in 1953 with their El Dorado, and Packard with their Caribbean that year as well. But the personal luxury car didn't really get cooking until Pontiac came with their midsize Grand Prix in 1969. The Grand Prix had been a full-size car from 1962 through 1968, but the new Grand Prix, which actually rode on a shortened wheelbase version of GM's four-door intermediate chassis, 2- and 4-door 1964 through 1976 GM Intermediates rode on different wheelbase lengths, was a somewhat smaller car that took many a styling cue from the classic cars of the 1930s. With its heroically long hood and short deck, there was nothing else quite like it on the market at the time. For 1971, Pontiac updated the Grand Prix with a new front end that featured single or composite headlights that were highlighted by a fluted or Jaguar-esque hood. I like the 71 update better than the 69 and 70 models that had 4 headlights and a comically large grille or schnoz, but I wouldn't kick a 69 or 70 out of my garage if one was to magically appear there. The personal luxury cars of the 1970s were an evolution of the muscle car craze that by the end of the 1960s and especially into the 1970s, for a number of reasons, was quickly coming to an end. Chevrolet came with their own version built on the same specialty chassis, known as the G-Body, in 1970. They called that car the Monte Carlo. Number 1. 1949 Cadillac. Surprise, surprise, another Cadillac. Well, if the brake shoe fits, as we say. My putting a 1949 Cadillac at the top of my list may surprise some people who know that when I was a kid, I was generally not the biggest fan of cars made before 1960. Cars before 1955 in particular, and especially something before 1950. I thought swoopy, too-tall cars like this looked like set pieces in The Godfather. They were quaint and old-timey looking. In fairness, many of them were. There's a timelessness, though, to these Cadillacs that I've come to be very fond of. Its balance and proportions are perfect. It's subtly elegant and oozes class and panache in ways few other cars ever made have. I chose a 1949 over a 1948, which are all but identical, because starting in 1949, Cadillac featured their new overhead valve V8 engine that would be the benchmark, if not blueprint, for most GM V8 engines to come over the next 75 years or so. I pity 1948 Cadillac buyers because their cars have the old, heavy, and trucky Cadillac flathead engine. Cadillac updated their lineup for 1950, and through my scratched-up goggles, they botched it up big time. What was a lean, lithe design became squash-looking and bloated. Cadillac didn't come with another design I find remotely as compelling until 1957. Well, there you have it, my top 10 best GM designs from their golden era of 1948 through 1972. I appreciate you watching, and feel free to agree or disagree in the comments section below.